Hi guys. Before we proceed to this
Hi
video,
guys.
we've got something
Before we
very
proceed to this
important to
video,
share with
we've
you.
got something very important to share with
Neoliberalism,
you.
Inequality, and
Neoliberalism,
Authoritarianism by
Inequality,
Professor
and
Jon V.
Authoritarianism
Kofas
by
is
Professor
available for
Jon V.
purchase. You can
Kofas
order it
is
directly from
available
the
for
publisher
purchase. You
Little
can order
French
it directly
eBooks
from the
or
publisher
through
Little French
Amazon.
eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to an analytical session on the topic of gerontocracy, a classical Greek word which means rule by elders, and its impact on democracy. The question, of course, has been, especially in the United States, but other countries from Japan, South Korea to Europe, Latin America, whether gerontocracy is an impediment to democracy, whether gerontocracy is an impediment to human progress and to civilization, or whether it is, as many from the classical era, from ancient Greece and Rome, as well as China, which includes Confucius in the 5th century BC, believe that in fact gerontocracy is a plus, not a minus for society, and it should be sought out. I want to start with a public opinion poll, very recent, in May 2025 in New York, which in the state of New York, which indicates that the senior senator from the state, Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, the Senate leader, the Senate Democratic leader, I should say, is trailing in this public opinion poll Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 33% for Schumer, 54% for AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, by both Republican as well as Democrat registered voters. Now, Chuck Schumer is 74, roughly 40 years older than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, the question here is it because he's roughly 40 years older than the Congresswoman from New York City, that he's trailing, or is it something else? Is it public policy? Both domestic and foreign policy. Let's look at foreign policy. Chuck Schumer has been a supporter of the state of Israel, regardless of his criticism of Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, even when the International Court of Justice, the ICC, the United Nations, most of the governments in the world, and progressive Democrats, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, agreed that Israel has been committing genocide and is continuing to do so to this day. So that's one issue. He has been an avid supporter. His argument that the problem is really not the apartheid state and ethnic cleansing and the war crimes, it's really this one individual, Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay. On domestic policy, in March 2025, Chuck Schumer, I think another 8 or 9 Democrats voted for Trump's budget, which to the mainstream as well as to the progressive wing of the Democrat Party, led by, of course, Senator Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was an anathema. Voting for such a budget was not only bad public policy, but it symbolized that the Democrats were endorsing a government which they're on record as viewing counterproductive to society's progress, counterproductive to American pluralism, diversity, fairness, and equity, considering that Trump, and until recently Musk, although Musk is now out, went after pluralism, after diversity, fairness, and equity in cleansing the federal government of people as well as programs devoted to such goals to bring about greater, not less, pluralism, diversity, fairness, and equity. So the question here is age a difference? Now, here's the issue that is of importance that makes this even more complex. Senator Bernie Sanders, also Jewish, like Chuck Schumer, by the way, from Vermont, is really the mentor for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Here in AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been going out and to various cities throughout the past few months in a campaign against the American oligarchy that is undermining democracy. It just so happens that Senator Sanders is 9 years older than Chuck Schumer. Yet, Senator Sanders, the mentor of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is supporting policies which are progressive, New Deal, Keynesian social welfare policies versus corporate welfare, which Chuck Schumer supports, and is for peaceful resolution to conflict, diplomatic solutions, not forever war doctrines that the mainstream Democrats have embraced. Now, the interesting thing here, this gets even more complicated. The interesting thing here is that gerontocracy, in general, is something that right-wing elements oppose, whereas liberals are more lenient as well as progressives on this issue. For example, a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2022, Elon Musk gave an interview to a business magazine of some sort where he was asked about this issue. And of course, he castigated the idea of gerontocracy, attributing all the ills befalling society to gerontocracy. When in fact, a couple of years later, namely from 22 to 24, 2 years later, he went ahead and backed a candidate who was the oldest for running for president, namely Trump at 79, right? Rather than Kamala Harris, much younger. So what we have here is the hypocrisy of the right wing on the one hand, and this is consistent with them, castigating gerontocracy and using it as a pretext and to deflect focus from the real issue, which is the social contract in society, public policy, both domestic and foreign policy. And here is case in point. We have an individual, one of the richest men in the world, saying, well, gerontocracy is really the problem. And then he supported the candidate for president and worked for the candidate for president once Donald Trump did become president, came into the White House. Elon Musk also came to the White House as the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, the DOGE group. So what we have here is indeed right-wing hypocrisy as a distraction from the real problem, which, as Salon magazine argued in running a piece on this issue of Elon Musk and the issue of gerontocracy, arguing that this is indeed a distraction from the real issue, which is plutocracy, another Greek word. Actually, it's ancient Greeks used to combine words. Plutocracy, it comes just like gerontocracy. Gerontocracy is actually two words, gero, which means old, krasi, which means kratos, which it means rule or state. And so plutocracy is plutos, which means riches, wealth, krasi, which is state, ruled by the rich. The problem is ruled by the rich. In other words, the problem is at the core the inequality that has been exacerbated under the neoliberal political economy in the last 50 years. And that is at the core, not the age of people. Now, I want to point something out here, which is common sense, and people all over the world, it doesn't matter whether we're in Japan, because there is a discussion there, debate there, or in South Korea, by the way, they're having elections, or anywhere else in Europe, for example, about the issue of gerontocracy. It is common sense to assume that no one wants to have people conducting public policy, old or young, but it's just assumed that the older the person becomes, and it's common sense to assume that they have illnesses, and the mind that is not as sharp, and so forth and so on. So you have basically the association of an older person, senility and memory problems and physical inability. And who wants a person like that conducting public policy? So the idea here is that that's the common sense view, that why subject society to individuals who are elderly. The other assumption is, well, the elderly, if they're in charge of society, if they're in charge of the state, rather, making public policy, whether legislative or at the head of the state as prime ministers or presidents or dictators, they tend to favor the elderly because they're older. That's another assumption, which I don't know how much we can take, how seriously we can take that on. In any case, the question of gerontocracy really became important. I remember it as in the United States as early as the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan became president. He was rather old, but he institutionalized neoliberalism. So he became a hero of Wall Street and a hero of the far right and of the conservatives. And he neoliberalized, if you will, the Republican Party and took it to the right. So his ideology, his ideological predisposition transcended his age. Now, it is just as interesting that just a few years before Reagan was elected in 1980, in the 1970s, the West, including American analysts, were basically satirizing the old Soviet leadership, arguing, Leonid Brezhnev and so forth, the old guard of the Kremlin, arguing that it's a bunch of old people leading the Soviet Union, and it's true, it was on its way to collapse, because it did collapse when Mikhail Gorbachev took over, and he tried glasnost and perestroika, and that went nowhere. And of course, the Soviet bloc dissolved by 1990. So the West was basically arguing gerontocracy was the problem with the old Soviet bloc, and especially with the Soviet Union. Now, what if there were 35-year-olds, like Ocasio-Cortez is in the United States, as old as she is today, back then in the 1970s in the old Soviet Union? Would the Soviet system have survived? Would the Soviet bloc have survived? In other words, is it the age of the individual in charge, or is it a systemic problem that is at issue here? Is it the social contract, or is it the individual, regardless of whether that individual is 80 or 30? And that is what I want to discuss. Now, from the 5th century BC, when the great Chinese philosopher Confucius took up this issue, and of course, he was in favor of gerontocracy. making all the favorable common sense assumptions that it is true, and it is true, that human beings, as they accumulate experience, life experience, they accumulate a certain amount of wisdom. It is not true, of course, that human beings, that there is an ipso facto correlation between age and wisdom, because an individual can be 75 and not be bright at all, and someone else can be 35 and be very bright. So intellect has really little to do with age. Nevertheless, from Confucius in the 5th century BC to Plutarch in the 1st century Rome AD, Plutarch was a Greek philosopher living during the Roman Empire era, to modern day thinkers, and especially in our own era, what we have is the issue of gerontocracy prevailing basically as a topic of debate. And the question is there merit to the issue of gerontocracy as either enhancing social progress, enhancing peace, enhancing social justice, enhancing progress in civilization, or is it an impediment? And this is what I want to spend a little bit of time today analyzing. And I'm going to start with an overview of some literature that has been written on this by psychologists, philosophers, sociologists, various thinkers, historians, and political scientists. And the interesting thing is that most agree, of course, and this goes back to Machiavellian thinking. Niccolo Machiavelli was an Italian philosopher in the 16th century, who is famous mostly publishing the work entitled The Prince. One of the works that he published is entitled The Prince, where he made certain assumptions about human nature before arriving at what is the best form of government, or if you will, the most efficacious form of government for society. Similarly, thinkers in various disciplines who deal with the issue of gerontocracy, the rule by elders, make certain assumptions about human nature. You cannot obviously have a serious debate on this if you assume that all older people are wise. All older people have common experiences that make them better suited, I should say, for public policy, for running government. That is just not true. However, there is a cultural component to this, and I think that I'm going to say a few more words about this in due course, and that is depending on society. For example, this is more typical of Chinese society, Japan, Asian societies, Eurasia, Russia, for example, than it is of some of the Western post-Renaissance society. The culture really has a lot to do with the issue of how thinkers themselves, political philosophers and psychologists and sociologists, view the issue of gerontocracy. Because in some cultures, there is the assumption that respect must be paid more, and that a paternalistic system is something like Confucius. And you also have that, by the way, present in during the Russian Empire period under the Romanovs. but also the Soviet era. It lingers on through the Soviet era. So paternalism is embedded into this. Now, clearly, with the advent of the scientific revolution and the technological revolution from the 17th century onward, and then the industrial revolution of the 18th century, which coincides with the Enlightenment, namely that human beings must realize their creative potential and contribute to the collective of society, obviously regardless of age. This is something that is an 18th century Enlightenment era ideal. And toward the end of the 18th century, the Enlightenment, some of those Enlightenment ideals are manifested in the French Revolution of 1789. And clearly, some of the great leaders, some of the most important, maybe not so great, depending on one's point of view, ideological and political point of view, but some of the leaders of the French Revolution, for example, Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, these were younger people. However, when you look at the ideological inspiration behind Robespierre and Danton, it came from people who were much older previously in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment period, of course, from people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire. So what you have is really the younger people in the activist role, and the assumption that in fact youth is linked to political activism, it's linked to change, it's linked to progress. But in fact, the ideological proponents of that, when you go back, actually even as far back as the 17th century, late 17th century, with the father of Western liberalism, namely John Locke, the fact is that these people were much older. The idea of change transcends intergenerational boundaries. It isn't true that somehow people, as people become, there is a red line, you reach, let's say 50, and then after that you become super conservative and you don't want change. You don't want, although it is a common view, empirical evidence notwithstanding, that the elderly people want no change for anything. So there is this assumption. Now, some of the great changes, systemic changes in society, came as a result of older people, not younger people. This is true, for example, one of the most famous in the 20th century was Mahatma Gandhi at the age of 77, who witnessed the end of British colonialism in India. Mahatma Gandhi had many supporters. Yes, many of them were young. And Mahatma Gandhi appealed to the young, just as Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, liberating, of course, that country from British rule. So we have anti-colonialist Kenyatta and Gandhi at advanced ages leading society to progress with a following that is young. So the gerontocracy theory clearly is dispelled by empirical evidence in history. Now, why is it, though, that we have in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, and especially in the 21st century, the first quarter of the 21st century that we're living in right now, and especially in the transatlantic countries with the United States heading the G7, this view coming primarily from the far right and the conservatives, that although they don't practice it, that gerontocracy is an anathema for society and for progress. Okay. One reason is because society is in crisis. It's very simple. And they're not going to blame the social contract. They're not going to blame, as Salon magazine in its article on Musk, and of course that whole business being against gerontocracy, pointed out, they're not going to blame plutocracy because they're the ones who are the plutocrats. They are going to blame people are just too old to be in. If we only had younger people. And it's interesting, by the way, that a lot of the criticism comes from high-tech people who want to project the image of youth, who want, at least they did back in the 90s when this was in its embryonic stage. By now, of course, 35 years later, these people are old too. But they still try to project that image, although the fact is that they are just as hypocritical as Musk and interested in deflecting from the core issue, which is the social contract, the structural impediments to social justice and to peace and to equitable distribution of wealth. Now, the crisis of decline of the West, and that's real, by the way, when you look at the metrics, when you look at the reality of where the US was in 1990 versus China in terms of GDP, especially in purchasing power parity, and where these two countries are today, and where the G7 were in 1990 versus where they are today in relationship to the BRICS. Obviously, the BRICS didn't exist in 1990, but it's much later. It comes up much later. But when you look at the fact that the BRICS group, the China-led, India, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, and a few global South countries, and constantly expanding, that group's GDP is greater than that of the G7. When you look at what the IMF and the World Bank are saying in their projections with regard to where the US and the transatlantic West will be by the middle of this century versus BRICS-led, the China-led BRICS group in just a few years, in just 25 years, then you can see that there is a scramble to basically apportion blame. And when you say, well, it's just old people, no wonder we have problems. A bunch of old people are in charge of the government. And it is true, by the way, it is true that in the United States, the average age of citizens is 38, I believe, 38, 39. The average age of an elected official is 59, 60, something like that. So it's quite a gap. It's true. And that, in fact, of all the professions, the eldest are people in the Senate and Congress and the White House. And it is true that just recently there was the announcement that former President Joe Biden has a serious illness, although that was well known. The question is, what if Joe Biden didn't have an illness? What if Joe Biden was 40 instead of 70 78 when he took office in 2021. What if he was 40 in 2021 instead of 78? Would he have followed policies that would have been different than those he followed in the years he was president? That's the issue, not how old he was. And here, this is important because what we have here is the reality that the Democratic Party, especially, has had problems, and it's been subject to criticism by the right, by the way, especially, but some on the Democratic side as well, that they have allowed elderly people like Biden, like Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, among others. And Chuck Schumer is, like I quoted, I started out with the Chuck Schumer poll versus Alexandria Cortez, that he's falling behind. Well, he's old, that's why. That's not the reason he's behind. Even Jewish voters in New York State, by the way, support Alexandria Cortez. They support him by the exact same percentage as the non-Jewish population. That tells you the whole story. And they support Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, not by the same percentage as non-Jewish population, but 12% more than they support Chuck Schumer. So it's the policy. It has nothing to do with age or ethnicity or religion. It's the policy. That is an issue. Now, political identity is important in all cultures, and the United States is no different. Usually, historically at least, it has been, at least until Reagan, it had been trendy to be young and a Democrat. And indeed, public opinion polls indicate that younger people tend to identify, their identity is toward the Democratic Party in the United States. They tend to identify more with the Democratic Party as a pluralistic, for cultural reasons, not necessarily the politics, but cultural reasons. And social policy, lifestyle, more identity politics, which the Democratic Party promotes in any case, okay, has been promoting from Clinton to Biden, okay. There is a far lower percentage of young people identifying with the Republican Party. However, what has happened, especially since the crisis of 2008, the Great Recession of 2008, is that more and more young people, both in the United States as well as in Europe, and Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, India, a number of Latin American countries, including Brazil, okay, are increasingly, this is not by any means a majority, are increasingly a segment of the young people leaving the more liberal, pluralistic, and progressive wings of centrist and leftist parties, and they have become far right. In Europe especially, when you look at Europe, what you find is that the impetus for the far right is not coming from old people, it's coming from the young people, Whether it's the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, okay, or the neo-fascist party led by Marine Le Pen in France, any of the right-wing parties in Europe, okay, it's young people that are behind it. Giorgia Meloni is one of the youngest leaders in Italy, Prime Minister of Italy. Some of the youngest, in fact, leaders who are far right are young. President Trump recently hosted the self-styled dictator of El Salvador. He's young. The prince of Saudi Arabia, who is the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, is young. So some of the far right-wing leaders are not part of the gerontocracy. They're young. Now, it's true we have people like Modi, Narendra Modi in India, who is not young. Trump is not young. Yet, the gerontocracy label doesn't stick to authoritarian neoliberals like Modi and Trump, although Trump was older when he took office in 2025 than Biden when he took office in 2021. It's Biden that the label gerontocracy stuck to, but not to Trump. This is the interesting thing, which again is indicative of how the issue of gerontocracy has been a distraction. This is not anything new. I should point out that in ancient China, especially after Confucius, the idea of having elders in charge of government was encouraged. Confucius did believe in a paternalistic society, that in fact the elders in charge of government were like the parents in the household. They would take care of the subjects. They would take care of the children, if you will. A very paternalistic view. It was assumed that they had greater wisdom. Again, no empirical foundation for such assumptions, but that was assumed, that they would act best for the children, for society, a paternalistic view. Although, again, they acted best for the elites of that society, regardless of whether it was in China or anywhere else. Okay? In the first century AD, during the era of the ascendancy of the Roman Empire, the Greek philosopher in Rome supported the idea of gerontocracy. In fact, the Roman Senate, the word Senate itself comes from the Latin senex, which means old, elderly. So the elder body, the body of the elderly. In ancient Sparta, long before the Roman Empire, in the 5th century, for example, and before that, the people in charge were, in the classical Greek word is gerousia, which means the elderly. The elderly controlled the state. They were entrusted with the state. So they too made assumptions from our ancestors from China to Western civilization, made assumptions that the elderly somehow had a greater amount of wisdom. They certainly had a lot of experience, greater, obviously, someone who is 30 doesn't have as much experience as someone who is 60. So it's that just goes without saying, and that is true. Now, however, the question of like I said, the capitalist industrial revolution, technological revolution, especially in the 19th century and thereafter, and especially the high-tech revolution, and with regard to artificial intelligence and the culture of Silicon Valley, promoted, on the surface at least, it promoted a youth culture. And here's what happened. They promoted that, but behind that rested the remnants of the yuppie culture of the 1980s. Let me just say something about the yuppie culture of the 1980s. 1968, according to scholarly literature, was the year against the status quo on a world scale. It was a year against gerontocracy on a world scale. However, gerontocracy symbolized the Vietnam War. It symbolized CIA-backed coups and dictatorships in the global South, regime change operations, in other words. It symbolized the support of the West, not just the US, of the West, of the apartheid regime of South Africa, and although they didn't call it apartheid, of Israel in the Palestinian lands. It symbolized the segregation politics in the until the Civil Rights Act of 1965 in the United States. 1968 was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated that same year. Okay, both advocates of civil rights. So there was an explosion from Paris to Mexico City to a number of American cities, an explosion, Chicago, most importantly, because of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. So there was an explosion against the status quo. It's just that gerontocracy was the symbol that best reflected that opposition by young people. And it's true, by the way, that throughout history, as I mentioned, from the French Revolution to the Arab Spring revolutions in the 2010s, it is true that young people are in the forefront, have been in the forefront of revolutions. That's true. The inspiration and the eclectic mixture of ideas emanates from the previous generation, from elderly, because these young people did not come from another planet, by the way. They're from right here. So they were molded by an environment which includes old people. So gerontocracy per se is not the issue. The issue is public policy. The issue is absence of social justice, whether it was in the 1960s with the civil rights movement in the United States, human rights violations all over the world, especially in the global South countries, supported by supposedly by the democratic transatlantic countries. They wanted democracy for themselves, but they didn't support it in the global South, in the what we used to call the third world back then. So they didn't support it there, but they accorded it to themselves, and within their own societies, to the middle class and the upper classes, not to dissidents, not to the working class, as the 1968 demonstration protests all over the world proved in the Western world. Okay. They claimed they were for peace. They claimed they were for peace, but they supported the nuclear arms race. That was another big issue. They claimed they were for pluralism, but they didn't support equality for women or for all ethnic and racial groups and religious groups. So what we have is gerontocracy symbolizing the status quo, the anachronistic status quo, and the desire to put an end to it. Let me come to another very important issue. Two more I'm going to elaborate on, and then we'll end it. The first one is neoliberalism and gerontocracy. On the surface, neoliberalism and the advent of the high-tech era in which we're continuing to be in today, with artificial intelligence supposedly being the panacea for society's civilization, for society's progress, and for civilization itself. This coincidence and the preeminent role of Silicon Valley, which is rooted in the yuppie culture of the 1980s. The yuppie culture of the 1980s was basically former many of the former so-called anti-establishment elements, the counterculture, the hippie culture of the 1960s and 1970s, adapting to the neoliberal culture of capital accumulation, the values of atomism, that is self-promotion and self-interest versus collective interest, versus the welfare of society, corporate welfare versus social welfare. Okay, the values of business and the rise of the business hero. This is the era when Donald Trump emerges. By the way, a young man who emerges on the scene and starts to cultivate the media, eventually having his own television program, reality TV program, and eventually being put up for president in 2016. So the values of the yuppie culture of the 1980s culminated in the Silicon Valley culture of the 1990s. And that culture presented an image of progress behind which was a very dangerous, a very counter-revolutionary course. And we see it now because a number of the leading high-tech prophets, not prophet, in other words, the sages, if you will, a number of these people who are in high-tech and presumptuously assume that they have monopoly on wisdom, have become part of what a number of scholars call the Dark Enlightenment. These are people who are against democracy. They're in favor of authoritarianism. Okay? These are people who see democracy and pluralism and diversity, fairness, and equity and social justice as impediments to capital accumulation. These are people who are, in fact, behind the political class promoting authoritarianism, regardless, by the way, of whether the Democrat pluralists with a thin facade of identity politics or openly authoritarian, like many in the GOP, for example, or in Europe, as well as other countries. So what we have is the high-tech hegemony of the economy passing on, inculcating into society its cultural values. And just because they wear blue jeans and a shirt, a t-shirt, I should say, and a t-shirt, doesn't mean that they are the hippies of the 1960s, who also wear a t-shirt and blue jeans instead of a three-piece suit. Doesn't make them the same thing. On the contrary, these are the apostles of the counter-revolution. These are the apostles of class war. These are the apostles of diluting democracy, viewing democracy as an impediment, as I said. It's not gerontocracy that is an impediment to democracy. Bernie Sanders, he's 83 years old. His followers are young people. They have been since 2016. And not just in the United States, but globally, young people are inspired by an 83-year-old man. Just like young people were inspired by Mahatma Gandhi globally, and I'm not elevating Bernie Sanders, although I like Bernie Sanders, I'm not elevating him to the level of Mahatma Gandhi. But the fact is, the following is not necessarily elderly, but young people. Why? Is it because of the age? They look beyond that. They're not that shallow. They look at policy. Where is their future? The future in terms of public policy, it transcends the age of the individual it's the only thing that matters is the policy itself. Is the policy intended to create a more equitable society, to bring about greater social justice, to bring about lower cost of housing, lower cost of education, lower cost of healthcare? Bernie Sanders, three major issues. Okay. Higher taxes on people who own the billionaire class, as he calls it, the oligarchy, as he and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez call it, who own more wealth than the bottom 90% of the population. Is the policy the issue, or is it the age of Bernie Sanders? Older than Trump, he's older than Trump, but notice nobody makes an issue of Trump's age. Hardly anyone makes. Some people do make an issue, but because he's fine, he's vibrant. We don't know about the reality of his physical. It doesn't matter. It's the policies that matter. Now, I want to, the last issue that I want to deal with is gerontocracy going beyond politics to the rest of the institutional structure. From the ancient times through the medieval times, the Renaissance, the period of the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, 19th century, second industrial revolution, to the present, the high-tech era, what we have is, in fact, gerontocracy in the entire institutional structure. That's the case today as well. Gerontocracy is in charge of the entire institutional structure. Yet, those who are critics of gerontocracy isolate only the political domain. And they go, here's where the problem is. They don't talk about gerontocracy in any other sector. For example, in the corporate sector. Look who the CEOs are. They're old. All of them. Practically all of them. Some of the young CEOs linked to high tech did come up in the 1990s and through there. But still, today, these are much older people, this 35 years later. So the fact is that the age issue sticks to politicians for those who want to deflect attention from the social contract based on lack of social justice, lack of equity for the working class, lack of equity for women, for minorities. They want to deflect attention just as they use other issues like migrants, like various religious and racial groups, ethnic groups. They are deflecting attention from their real issue, which is class warfare. That, as Warren Buffett agreed, it's not the working class that declared class warfare against us billionaires. We declared class warfare against them. Buffett was right. Warren Buffett, a billionaire, one of the richest men in the world, was right. The billionaire class declared class warfare against the working class. This is the reason that Trump won, given that the Democratic Party represented that Wall Street billionaire class and had abandoned the working class exactly as Senator Sanders argued, and exactly, unfortunately, too late, of course, when he made this admission, as former President Joe Biden mentioned on his way out the door of the White House in his farewell address. He mentioned that there is a danger in American society, namely the danger of the oligarchy. And then Sanders, of course, continues with the anti-oligarchy campaign with Cortez, taking this out to the public. The issue, therefore, of gerontocracy, which is the intergenerational conflict, is at the surface. There is no empirical evidence to indicate that all problems of any society, whether it's in Japan or South Korea or the United States or Italy, look at Meloni in Italy, look at younger people, El Salvador, you have a dictator. Look at any society you want. Problems of any society, it doesn't matter what it is, do not get solved because of the age of the leader or the legislative body, the average age of the legislative body. Although it is true, as I pointed out earlier, the United States legislative body is roughly, 24 years higher than the average American. So that's true. But even if it were the same, it was 38, let's say, 37, 38 years old, would the problems that American society have be any less because the age drops? That's the issue. The issue, I think, I am going to conclude by agreeing with many scholars and progressive journalists who, on this issue, the issue is in fact plutocracy. The issue is the rule of the rich, and any distraction from gerontocracy to trying to rid the country of migrants, as though, let's say by magic, all migrants were to disappear from America. Would that really solve any of the problems, the systemic problems of the United States? What would it do? They contribute to and enrich American culture and the American economy. Yet there are those who blame them for the calamities befalling society, systemic problems for which these people have nothing to do. They're just workers. They have nothing to do with those structural calamities. They have nothing to do with the erosion of democracy and the erosion of the socioeconomic, the social justice system. The fact is that there are socioeconomic inequalities that have been rising. This has been rising under neoliberalism in the last 50 years or so. So this is at issue. Gerontocracy is not an impediment to democracy. It's not an impediment to social justice. It is a pretext. I'm going to end it there. I'm going to thank you very much. Please comment, ask questions, join this channel. We would love to have you join this channel and follow us in other topics we are going to be discussing. Thank you very much.